Good evening, Mrs. Robinson, Professor Kilkelly, Professor Poustie, attendees. I would like to welcome each and every one of you to this fantastic event this evening. It is such an honour to be able to welcome not only former and first woman President of Ireland, but also former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and current climate justice activist, among many other things, Mary Robinson, to speak to us this evening about climate justice. I believe I speak for many of us here today when I say that Mary Robinson is a huge inspiration, not only for law students, but for young people all over Ireland. We are also very lucky to have our very own Professor Ursula Kilkelly, expert in children's rights and youth justice, to chair the event this evening. I would like to extend thanks to our distinguished speaker, Mary Robinson, our chair, Professor Ursula Kilkelly, the Dean of the School of Law, Professor Mark Poustie, and the School of Law as a whole for being so supportive of this event and so generous with their time. I would also like to thank the entire Executive Committee of the Law Society, in particular our Auditor, Bailey Lane, without whom this event would not have been possible. Without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce Bailey Lane, Auditor of the Law Society, who will present Mrs. Robinson as the inaugural recipient of the prestigious Mutatio Factorem Award. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Izzy. Hello and welcome all to this fabulous event hosted by the UCC Law Society. I first just want to say a few short thank yous to those who helped bring this event together and then virtually award Miss Mary Robinson with the inaugural Mutatio Factorem Award. I would first like to thank the School of Law here in UCC for their ongoing support and advice in bringing this event together, as well as developing this new award. As a top 100 law school in the world, it is great to have the expertise and support of all those involved. I would like to say thank you in particular to the Dean, Mark Poustie, and to our chair today, Professor Ursula Kilkelly. I would like to say a special thank you to our wonderful education officer, Isabel Gallagher, who put in a lot of work and time into making this event happen. I know Izzy was first in touch with Ms. Robinson back in May time in 2021, and it's great to see this event happening. While I know we would all love to have this event happen in person, we would love to have Ms. Robinson back in the future to formally present the award. Finally, I would like to say a thank you to Barbara, Mrs. Robinson's PA, and of course to our guest of honour tonight, Ms. Mary Robinson. This leads me on to the introduction and presentation of our award. This year, the Law Society and the Law School decided to introduce a new award called the Mutatio Factorem Award, as one which is awarded to some of the best and brightest in their fields who have brought about significant change and helped to advance discourse, as well as being an inspiration to young people across the college. As a society, we felt there was no better person than Ms. Robinson to be the founding recipient of this award for all her fantastic humanitarian, climate justice and political work she has done as President of Ireland within the EUN and right across her career. To conclude, I would like to say a thank you to all of those for attending, and again to Izzy and the Law Society for bringing this together. And finally to Mrs. Robinson for joining us tonight. Without taking any more of your time, I will now pass you over to the Dean of the Law School, Professor Mark Poustie, to say a few words on their behalf. Thank you.
Many thanks, Bailey, and good evening and welcome to everyone from the School of Law at UCC, and especially to former President Mary Robinson, and congratulations to you on your award, which the school is absolutely delighted to be associated with. We're really privileged to have such a proactive student law society, and we're delighted to work with them as they seek to develop their members into leaders of the future. Their initiatives fit extremely well with the school's mission of shaping a just society. These initiatives include, for example, their diversity and inclusion work, which I think is truly admirable, and their annual conference, which is always an immensely stimulating academic event. And in fact, it was yesterday, and it really was a great event. The fact that the society has adjusted so well to the challenging online environment in which we found ourselves and are only beginning to emerge from, I think also does them credit. I'm particularly delighted at the initiative shown by the Society in establishing the Mutatio Factorem Award. It does provide an opportunity to honour a really distinguished person who's been a significant change maker in their field and has helped to inspire young people in Ireland and across the world. And the school is really pleased to be associated with the award, and we're absolutely delighted that the founding recipient is former President Mary Robinson, Ireland's first female president. So I'd like to add my thanks to the Law Society, to Auditor Bailey Lane, to the Education Officer Isabel Gallagher, and indeed all the committee members for their initiative in bringing forward this award. and actually also for their other impactful initiatives this year. And without further ado, I'd now like to introduce your chair for this evening's event, my colleague, Professor Ursula Kilkelly, who's the head of the College of Business and Law. And as most will know, Professor Kilkelly is a globally recognized expert in children's rights and youth justice, and she serves as chairperson of the Oberstown Children's Detention Campus Board. So I'll now hand over to Professor Kilkelly. But as an environmental law scholar myself, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with Mary Robinson on climate justice.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everybody. Good evening, Mrs. Robinson. Good evening, Izzy, Bailey, everybody who's joined us this evening. It's a great pleasure to chair this event. Like all of you, I'm sorry we're not here in person, but as we've all become accustomed, I think the great value of remote events like this is that we can have possibly much greater reach through the wide audience we've got with us this evening, over 80 people online. And also, of course, we will have opportunity for discussion and debate as we go on and remember these events over the weeks and months to come. So they will stay with us, I'm sure, in a very real way. I would like now to introduce to you our guest speaker for this evening, although, as we've all heard, Mary Robinson really does need no introduction. But I think the depth and breadth of her experience and expertise is worth some articulation of the many achievements that we've witnessed over the years. Mary Robinson is adjunct professor for climate justice in Trinity College Dublin and chair of the Elders. She served as President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, and then UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002. She's a member of the Club of Madrid and the recipient of numerous honours and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from the President of the United States, Barack Obama. Between 2013 and 2016, Mary served as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy in 3 roles: first for the Great Lakes region of Africa, then on climate change leading up to the Paris Agreement, and in 2016 as a Special Envoy on El Nino and climate. Her foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, was established in 2010 and came to a planned end in April 2019. A former president of the International Commission of Jurists and former chair of the Council of Women World Leaders, she was president and founder of Realising Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative from 2002 to 2010, and served as honorary president of Oxfam International from 2002 to 2012. And she was Chancellor of the University of Dublin from 1998 to 2019. Mary serves as patron of the International Science Council and patron of the board of the Institute of Human Rights and Business, is an ambassador for the B Team, in addition to being a board member of several organizations, including the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and the Aurora Foundation. She recently became joint honorary president of the Africa Europe Foundation. Her memoir, Everybody Matters, was published in September 2012, and her book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future was published in September 2018. She's also co-host of a podcast on the climate crisis called Mothers of Invention. I'm not quite sure how you've managed to squeeze us in this evening. We're really, really pleased that you're with us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, first of all, I'm very honoured to receive this special award, Gurmila Mahagiv. I hope it will be, I'm the first of many distinguished recipients in the future. And knowing that I was going to receive this award as at the beginning, I was thinking about how law students are approaching learning law today, and indeed how law schools are approaching the teaching of law, because so much has changed since I was a law student way back in the middle of the last century. And in particular, I had no understanding of a slow-moving onset of a crisis that was happening. It was happening, but we didn't know about it. We didn't know that the world was creating these emissions that were going to cause a global warming that was going to face us with a truly existential threat as to whether we have a future. And when I was elected president, I never spoke about climate change. I did speak about the environment, but not about climate change, because it wasn't on the radar. We simply did not have an awareness that we have now of the fact that we face a world that needs to transform itself to cope with this reality. And when I became UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I was aware of the problem because another part of the UN was dealing with it, but I didn't relate it to my work as High Commissioner. You know, it was a big portfolio, if you like, giving leadership on a whole range of human rights for the UN. And I just missed how relevant it was to connect climate change, the climate crisis. It was after that when I was frustrated at the end of my 5 years as High Commissioner with what I saw as a kind of double standard, that we didn't take seriously enough the rights that really matter if you don't have them. Rights to food and water, health, education, shelter. And so I formed a very small NGO called Realizing Rights. I was connected with the Aspen Institute, and I was connected with a group in Geneva, a good human rights group. But we were very small, working in African countries on economic and social rights. There were I don't think there was any other organization, any other NGO actually doing that from the developed world in the developing world. So we were pioneering. How do you do work on economic and social rights, on right to health, for example, working with health ministries and then holding them to account for what they were doing. Much less judgmental, more developmental, and very interesting. And from the beginning, as I make it clear in my book on climate justice, I was startled really to find how impactful the climate crisis was in African countries. They were being hit. Ireland wasn't being hit. Europe wasn't being hit in the same way, but African countries were being hit. And that brought me to the concept of justice, the injustice of it, that the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples were being hit first and foremost and most destructively already in 2003, 2004, 2005 and beyond. And it was almost hard to come back to the world that I was working in and talk about it, because when I talked about climate justice in the early days, I was met with, yes, but that's not me. You know, a lack of a real empathy, a lack of a real sense of justice. I think we're beginning to have that sense, but I don't think we still have it nearly enough, to be honest, because we cannot actually talk about the climate crisis without seeing it through the prism of injustice. The layers of injustice that I have spoken about, and some of you will know that I've identified at least 5 layers of injustice. And I just want to go through those a little bit because they are really important in understanding the global north now and the global south, and where we are as a world in trying to address these issues. So the first injustice is the one I've already mentioned, I became aware of first, which is this reality of countries being much more vulnerable depending on their location, and of course the fact that they're very poor, and therefore the poorest countries and the poorest communities and indigenous peoples and communities were hit first. And of course they are the Black and brown and indigenous peoples in our world, so it's a racial injustice. And it's a racial injustice internally in countries with large racial populations, such as the United States. If you live in communities on the wrong side of the tracks, etc., you could be sure. And that's part of the reason why the first American story in the book is the story of the Hurricane Katrina and the Sharon, who as she said, had her salon and her home on the wrong side of the tracks because she was African American. And when they were devastated by the hurricane in East Biloxi, they got very little help. They got some support from FEMA, the federal agency, but she lived in a trailer and she was dirt poor, humiliatingly poor. And when she met with Constance O'Kellett, another story in the book, another hero of mine, who was a grandmother from Uganda, whose village had been wiped out. The two of them sat and spoke about their common experience. You know, one from America, one from Uganda. But when you're hit by something as devastating, that destroys everything, that drives you into a complete, absolute dirt, humiliating poverty, it really brings out your common humanity and what you find in yourself. And I remember Constance referring to her as Mississippi girl, and they laughed together and, you know, talked about how they tried to build their communities and make themselves more resilient. These were the stories that affected me in that first injustice. And it's also part of the second injustice, the women doing what Constance and Sharon were doing because of the different roles of women, the different power, the different access to credit, access to training, access to rights in some instances, like land rights. And yet it's women who have to put food on the table, have to go further in drought for water or firewood, etc. And the third injustice is the injustice that young climate activists have been telling us about. I was on a Zoom earlier today with two young climate activists whom I knew because I'd met them at COP26. One had done blogs for us on the Elders website, and the other I met just at the end of COP because Wangari Maathai, a daughter of Wanjira Maathai, a daughter of Wangari Maathai, a great Nobel laureate because of her work on human rights and peace and the environment and planting trees in Kenya. Her daughter had told me, you must meet Elizabeth, whom I met, and we had a great conversation, an intergenerational conversation this afternoon. I love those conversations because I learn so much. I'm really impressed by what young people around the world are doing now on climate and how active they are and proactive and determined. And that's why, in a way, I want this to be part of our conversation. And that's why I'm not going to speak for too long, because I actually want to hear, and I know the questions you want answers to, and I'll give the answers in a way that I hope will also encourage this kind of intergenerational learning across, which is so important. So the intergenerational injustice. And then the fourth injustice is a really, really important one now. The injustice of the different pathways to development. Industrialized countries like Ireland, we built our economies on fossil fuel. And our task now is to wean ourselves off as rapidly as possible and do it with just transition for the workers and their families. The just transition in particular in Ireland, as we know, is the peat, the bogs, the 400 workers who were laid off, the role that Bord na Móna is now playing in trying to get good jobs and re-greening, re-wetting the bogs so that they can be greened in a way that will allow for a future and also access, as I say, to the green jobs. And that's a task of the developed countries. But developing countries want to go green and have green jobs as well, but you can't go green from nothing. You have more than 600 million in Africa who don't have access to electricity, and 900 million who still cook on dirty cook stoves, as they say, because that's all they have. It's either wood or charcoal or animal dung, and it causes great health problems to them and the children who are surrounding their mother as she's cooking. Problems of asthma and terrible death problems from indoor air pollution. That's all they have available, but you can't, as I say, move easily. It needs a just transition in their case of access, probably in some countries, to gas, which we're now trying to ban in the rich world. But we have to be very careful about what we're doing, because it can be very unfair to prevent people from having access to electricity, access to energy, which is going to transform their lives. And then they can go green very rapidly. And Africa is not the polluting continent. It still has less than 5% of the pollution for the rest of the world. So when the European Development Bank says, we're not going to support gas projects anymore, think about that. You know, there's an injustice in even the way we are making current decisions about the world if we don't listen to the needs of developing countries coming out of the injustices they have been suffering. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. And I think that was the injustice that I came to last, and I now regard as being one of the most important, because it's the most important also in solutions, the nature-based solutions. And when we were talking earlier this afternoon, I was talking with Elizabeth from Kenya and Mitzi from the Philippines. Elizabeth said, I am nature. That is who I am. I am nature. That's how I feel. And I think if more and more of us can feel like that, we'll go a long way to understanding how connected we have to be with nature and with nature-based solutions moving forward. And you know that there's a lot of litigation now on climate as law students, and I'm sure in your courses you're learning about the Irish case and French and German and others that follow on the original Dutch Urgenda case, and cases all over the world that are happening because we're getting more precise about what's causing the pollution and what's causing the excesses that are being addressed in court cases. I'm not going to dwell on that particularly at this stage because I'm of the view that it's a matter, litigation will become more and more important and should be, because it can cut through some of the delays and some of the obfuscation that goes on. But at the same time, the climate issue, the climate crisis is so important that it really is a matter for everyone. And I want to give my sense of what I felt as the special envoy of the Secretary General before the Paris Agreement. I was a kind of observer at the ministerial meetings that took place before Paris. A lot of them were informal, extra ministerial meetings, because the French presidency said, we're not going to get there unless we talk about this in great detail and in great depth. And those were actually quite boring meetings. They were meetings where ministers from different parts of the world kept repeating their same lines over and over. But Tony de Broom of the Marshall Islands was the foreign minister, and he was at those meetings, and he kept saying, do you understand that if we don't have 1.5 degrees in the text, my country may not survive. My country will go under. We will no longer be a sovereign people. Is that what you want? And he sort of got that into the ear of people. And we marched in the street in Paris, 1.5 to stay alive. And in the halls, a high ambition coalition was formed. And Tony de Broom of the Marshall Islands was the leader of that coalition, even though it included the United States under Obama and the European Union and many other countries. And the purpose of the High Ambition Coalition was to get 1.5 degrees referenced formally in the text. And it took everything, because India, even when the conference started, India said, no way, we're not going to agree 1.5. And there were other countries hiding behind India. So it wasn't easy, but it was done. And the point was, scientists had never really studied the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. So the Paris Climate Agreement had to ask the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what is the difference? And then that was that report, which I hope you've studied, because it's probably the most important report to me. It's the special report on global warming in October 2018, which clarified that there's a huge difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and that in that band of time, bad things will probably happen. For example, the Arctic ice will probably melt entirely, and the coral reefs will probably disappear, and the permafrost that surrounds the Arctic in particular will melt even more than it's doing and throw up not just carbon, but methane. So it was a startling report. They said we have to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. They said you have 12 years. Well, now we know we have less than 8. And we're still not on track. The COP26, which I attended on behalf of the elders, did align us with 1.5, but didn't close the gap enough. when we added up everything that was pledged, we were still on course for a 2.4 degree world, which would be catastrophic. And when we say catastrophic, let me just say why I broke down a little bit at the COP when I heard that from Climate Tracker that we were on course for a 2.4 degree world, because I knew that that meant that anybody under 60 was likely to face an unlivable world. Anybody under 30 would certainly face an unlivable world. I mean, that is a really striking, startling reality that we somehow don't embrace enough, not to scare ourselves into no action, but rather to know what the scientists said when they made that report in 2018. They said, we have to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. It is doable if we have the political will. That was the scientist telling the politicians. It's still doable, and we have to have the political will. And everybody has to take at least 3 steps, and I'll end with these. The first step is you have to make the climate crisis personal in your own life. And that means you have to be doing something today and tomorrow that you weren't doing as much yesterday, whether it's recycling better, whether it's being determined not to use private transport when you can use public transport, whether it's changing your diet. Just make it personal, own it. You actually feel better when you own it, because then you'll be active, and that somehow helps the climate anxiety that a lot of young people are feeling. Secondly, get angry with those who aren't doing enough. Angry locally, angry nationally, angry internationally, both with governments, with cities, with local authorities, whatever, but also with business, with investment, with those big polluters and investors in what is harming us. And thirdly, and this is the one I really want to end on before I address the questions, we need to imagine this world that we're hurrying towards. We have to get there in 8 years. We have to make a real difference. It will be a much healthier world because we will have much less of the pollution of fossil fuel, which causes huge indoor and outdoor pollution deaths, more than 8 million deaths a year. So, that's part of it. We're going to see a lot of greening of our cities, urban gardens, urban food production. We're going to see a lot of rewilding of our nature. And farmers will benefit directly from the carbon that they sequester. I know that there are models now where farmers can get paid directly for the carbon that they can sequester in their fields, in individual fields. We have the technology to do it. We haven't got it online for farmers yet, unfortunately, because when we do, it will change farming, and farmers will realize that they can benefit directly. And all of these benefits are ones that we have to be talking about, learning about. Universities have to be at the head of kind of research into what are the positives that we need to be rushing towards, because then we will have the collective energy to get there. And I'll stop at this point, and Professor Kilkelly will ask any questions.
Thank you, Mary. That was a tour de force, both with regard to the problem and really practical and helpful solutions, I think. And so many of the questions that the students have posed this evening are about what they can do. And I suppose particularly what can law students do? And I think this was particularly thinking of the student activism, but also the capacity and the potential of law to affect change. So them as empowered legal advocates, where do you see the role for legal advocacy and the role of the law student in all of this?
Well, I do think it's important. I didn't spend a lot of time on the litigation because I thought probably that's something that maybe is being studied in class, or hopefully the cases are being addressed because they show the role. Let me tell you a story about the International Bar Association coming to Dublin in 2012, and they invited me to be one of the guest speakers at a luncheon event. And I kind of let fly, and I said the law was completely behind the curve on the climate crisis, that the International Bar Association should have a task force and have a major report. And lo and behold, what did they do? They actually took it seriously and had a task force. And I had to go to Tokyo 2 years later for the launch of a report, which is on their website, which is called something like something about justice in a climate disconnected world or something. It's a strange title, but it's a very good report. And they have continued to address as the major legal body in the world, but at every level. I know that UCC is proud of its record on environmental issues and was ahead of a number of the Irish universities on that, and I give credit for that. Every sort of step and every innovation matters, every legal innovation. We need to think about regulations which will help us to speed up our climate transformation in Ireland. How are we going to do it in a way that doesn't hurt people who are energy poor? Because energy prices are rising at the moment. Buying organic food is more expensive. It shouldn't be. It's to try and even all of those issues. And I think law and regulation can play a real role in relation to that. And it's thinking of practical ways to ensure that going green is obvious and easier than it is now, rather than being expensive and more difficult. So it's thinking in many ways about how to rejig the system to make sure that we've got the right priorities.
One of the really interesting and I think really powerful experiences of the last number of years has been the raised youth voice, the role of youth activism, and how powerful that has become in our advocacy around climate justice and climate change issues. And certainly in the Irish context, it's been credited with the increased vote for the Green Party, with young people, if you like, pestering their parents and grandparents about these issues, about how critical they are to their lives. And I'm wondering, in the context of the intergenerational conversations that are so important that you've referenced this evening, are there particular ways in which you find it useful for young people themselves to engage with other generations about these issues? I think one of the challenges is that communicating the urgency and the critical nature of these issues to the older generation.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation because the two, Elizabeth and Mitzi, were in their 20s, and I'm in my more than late in my late 70s. Let's put it that way. And that's a good conversation, but it's not enough. We should be also linking in the generations in the middle, who are actually the generations who have the power to do things. Mm-hmm. One of the things we did say and agree on was the need for more willingness to enable young people to be at the decision-making table. Whether it's as delegates at a COP, not to be out in the very vibrant civil society discussions, but to be where the decisions are taken and be listened to for those decisions, because they have, a huge vested interest in their, being real change. And that's why, so many young people feel that sense of urgency. I also feel it's really important, and we addressed this in the podcast Mothers of Invention that you referenced, which has the kind of what's the word, the byline that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. I always explain that climate change is generic, man-made is generic, and that a feminist solution includes as many men as possible, and hopefully most of your student body at this stage, male or female, can think of themselves as feminists, because a feminist solution is it's the solution that the women's movement developed as a way of doing. It's problem solving, it's listening, it's non-hierarchical, it's taking tough decisions when you need to, but bringing people with you. And we've seen a number of women leaders do this through the COVID crisis. In fact, in a way that I think has helped women's leadership on the world stage, if I could put it that way. But the intergenerational, I think we need to strategize to bring in all generations, not just the grandparents and grandchildren type discussion.
And I think it's really interesting to observe the challenges that the young people involved in these debates have encountered, and you rightly mentioned the fact that they don't always get positioned at the decision-making table. They're in the civil society in the streets more than they are in the boardroom or in the political rooms making those decisions. And I think that's an area of my own work that I think it goes beyond the area of climate justice. It's quite universal. And I'm wondering whether you've experienced or seen the impact on young people of the challenges of those debates, how they can, and recommending, I suppose, to our students who are at the forefront of advocating for change, what advice would you give them in terms of their improved capacity to be heard, to be positioning themselves in those situations?
Well, first of all, it's not quite your question, but it's the point I wanted to make, and then I lost my thread, I think. When young people become aware of just the scale and urgency of the crisis, they can get very worried and fraught about it. And young climate activists, in my experience, can be really exhausted. That was a phenomenon that I saw a lot in Glasgow. I remember being with Vanessa Nakate just before we spoke at a conference in a virtual meeting of the University of Glasgow. And I said to her, how are you, Vanessa? Because I know her, for quite a bit now. And she said, I am exhausted. And so in our podcast, Mothers of Invention, we asked climate activists, we asked every woman that we spoke to, what about your own self-care? And we got two kinds of answers. We either got that exhausted one, or we got, well, I know I have to be careful. I do yoga, or I walk in the woods, or I've got a hobby now that relaxes me. And I think that's really important. But directly, how do young people make more impact? I think it is by insisting on nothing about us without us, that philosophy, and making sure in as far as possible that they're at the table. And the point is, young people are digitally connected. They read a great deal that they're slightly older, even family members may not read about what's going on in the world. They feel very connected with the issues, and they are entitled to be listened to because their views are very informed. It's very different from the old days when young people, were supposed to listen to their elders. I know, I had a beloved grandfather, and I listened to him about law and justice, but I wouldn't have dreamt of expressing my own views, I think, at the time, because that wasn't. But I do feel now young people are entitled to be listened to because they are smart, connected, digitally smart. They see the problem in a different way. And actually, when I talk to young people, and I mean really young, I mean 11, 12, 13-year-olds, they have this sense of connection with those affected by climate who are much worse off. And they express this in terms of love. I was on a panel in the Madrid conference with an 11-year-old from Oslo, and she said, "But we know that we in Scandinavia are very lucky, but we know there are many who are much worse off, and we know we have to be there for them, and we love them." And it was just something, it just blew me away because it was so full of empathy, a real empathy.
And the child's perception of justice is also very strong. So I think you speak to those elements as well when you talk to and with young people about these issues. A related point is in relation to the question about marginalized voices. So in particular, whether there's an experience in COP26, so just generally those marginalized voices that are less heard in discussions and conversations and decision making about climate justice.
Yeah, I mean, and that really is another part of the injustice, because the marginalized voices are those who probably know most, A, what the problem is, and B, how they are in the process of addressing it by building their own resilience, helping their community, doing, I mean, I've spent a good deal of time listening to my Indigenous friends, Hindu Omara Ibrahim, whose story is in the book. I mean, think of her as, a child who'd come in from countryside to the city because her father unusually allowed her to be educated, and then being bullied by the other children because she smelt of milk, because she used to help her grandmother milk the cows. And she stood up to that bullying, and that started her on a whole life of being one of the really well-known now climate activists. She's still young, she's still in her 30s, but she has addressed the Security Council, she has gone to Davos, she has been because she is a voice for her community, she stays true to her roots. She hasn't, sort of gone into that world and got lost. She's very grounded in the reality and speaks all the time about the reality of her Indigenous community in Chad and what they need and how they are affected by the lake that has disappeared, etc. So I think it's really important to speak from the world you know and you understand. So for Cork students, for students in UCC, we're not all from Cork, obviously. It's a question of, for example, flooding is going to be a huge problem in Ireland. We're lucky that we have escaped the sort of precipitation that climate change brings. It's rain beyond belief. It will hit us, and it will do what happened in Germany to those villages, and we're not prepared. So it's a kind of it's creating a broad awareness of how we need to manage to cope with nature-based solutions and with proper protection against flooding, physical protection against flooding in combination in ways that are very well thought out. But it's just an example of that's the major issue for Ireland, is going to be flooding in particular, and storms and erosion along the coast, which is already happening.
And I think that connection between the local and the global is so important in terms of learning the lessons, but also I think staying connected, as you say, to what's your authentic experience. I think a lot of our students are very ambitious and want to be on the global stage, want to be advocating in the UN want to be the global or UN ambassador type roles. But the value and the importance of the local, the community influence, the community experience is so powerful, isn't it? In connecting and also being able to speak to that experience.
Yes, I remember when I was looking for votes in 1990, I was invited to an early conference in what's that place in West Cork that I'm just Allihy.
Allihy's, yeah.
And it was a conference of coastal communities from around Ireland. And I think it was the first such conference, and it was so vibrant that everybody was speaking with such interest and enthusiasm and sharing experiences, etc. And one of the people there said to me, when you're in the so-called periphery, it's not a periphery, it's the center. And it was a lesson that I took with me as a candidate and then as president, not to think of remote areas as being a periphery, it's the center for people's lives. And it was just a very key lesson at a very useful stage, because I went on to talk about the importance of the islands. I visited the islands as well, and it kind of it helped have that sense of knowing the importance of place,
which is a huge for all of us, I think, but specific to these challenges. I might turn to some of your other experiences in life, Mary, I was struck by and have read about the process of sort of awakening that you went through to realize that this is the issue of our time, having been really a lifelong human rights advocate and lawyer, among many other things. And I'm struck also by the dynamic that power plays in all of these discussions and debates, whether it's in the context squarely of human rights or the related area of climate justice. But I'm wondering, in terms of all of your achievements, what are you most proud of?
I actually don't ever think of that. I mean, I genuinely don't know how to answer that. And I think, you know, somehow that's for somebody else or something. I just want to go on and do the next thing.
Next thing, yeah.
Do the next thing. I mean, you mentioned, and I want to give it as an example, you know, but I suppose I was at the time quite proud that we were able to do it. When the Africa Europe Foundation was put together in December a year ago, just before it was launched, both Ellen Johnson Sirleaf for Africa and me for Europe, we were approached to be the honorary women presidents. And we got together and we said, look, honorary president is nothing, you know, it's blah, blah, blah. But what if we formed a women leaders network? And then we can get the women's voice in at the very early stages of this important Africa Europe powerful foundation, which it is. And it actually worked. So that's the way I think. And I'm on to the next time I can do something like that.
The motivation is that influence, the capacity to affect change, though, which is at the heart of everything you've done. Really, is that exploiting every aspect of your experience and your expertise to affect change for the good in whatever setting you've been in. Is that something that you've always had with you, that desire for change and responsibility to affect change where you can?
Yeah, it certainly was something that I felt very strongly about when I was a law student in Trinity. I became auditor of the Law Society because I was that pushy, you know, I put myself forward. And actually, it may be of interest to some students, I was actually very shy as a student initially. I had been shy in secondary school and tried to force myself into debating because I wanted to be able to, you know, make my views known. I felt strongly about things, and I debated in Trinity, and I went up to UCD to debate as well, because Trinity wouldn't allow you to debate in the Hist in my time because I was a woman. You know, we were barred from debating, and UCD was more open in that regard. So I went there as well. Took part in lots of debates, but often literally lost the thread or lost the whole plot because I was so shy that I'd gone blank. And I kept at it until I became fluent enough for that no longer to be a problem. And still, when I'm doing anything, including, you know, before speaking to you this evening, I always get that bit nervous. And I'm glad I do, because I think it probably helps. But, yeah. But you know, I think having a sense of purpose and seeing the justice of issues can really help to give you a sense of how you can change things. And I would encourage students to, you know, be aware that we can all do whatever it is that will change a little. And if we change a little, it's the drips that come together as an ocean eventually.
Yeah, and it's so true. I mean, the other, you can derive so much from your own self motivation, and clearly have. But I'm sure as you've inspired many, are there people out there over the years who've inspired you? Clearly, you talk about many of your peers and your colleagues in the climate justice community in those terms. Are there people you've met, worked with, who you really have really inspired you?
I think, you know, the people that I wrote about in the climate justice book, you know, fit that very well, because I learned from each of them. You know, I learned so much from Constance O'Kellett, of, her resilience in Uganda, in her village. I learned from Sharon Henshaw, how she coped as an African-American woman. The other story in the United States was the scientist Patricia Cochrane from Alaska, who was watching the erosion of houses and even villages in Alaska, and no money in the great United States for either repair or if villages had to move because of this sea level incursion. And as I mentioned, people like Hindu, so they would be heroes. I did have strong people in my family. They were nuns who did a lot. Both my father had two sisters, both of whom became nuns, and I had aunts who were nuns. One particular aunt was a Reverend Mother, and I was very close to her, but she was retired by the time. At the age of about 15 or 16, I would take her on, and we had great fun because she liked being taken on in a way, and we had a relationship. And my grandfather had a great influence on me as a lawyer, speaking about justice. And also I read about others like I read about Gandhi, and I read about Martin Luther King, and they very much influenced my sense of justice as well. And I was very honored when I was president of Ireland to be at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. It was the first time I met him. I then made a state visit to South Africa in 1996, 2 years later. And it was a wonderful state visit, lots of funny moments, but I haven't time to tell you about those. And then to be asked by him to become part of the elders was such a huge honor. And I have learned a great deal from my fellow elders because there's a simplicity and a modesty and a humility in each of them that I hope I can in some way emulate. And the humor is very much part of it. I mean, we've just had the funeral, which I was honored to be at over the new year of Archbishop Tutu, Arch, as he loved to be called. And I learned so much about him, from him. I wish I'd learned it earlier, actually, including the use of humor to make people relaxed and then come in with your more serious message. It's a wisdom that I now pass on to others.
It's nice to think you can learn that, actually. I think we have this sense of some, I mean,
I'll give you
more charismatic people are.
I'll give you a specific example of why I hadn't learned it early enough. I made two addresses to the Oireachtas, to the houses of the Oireachtas as president. I put my heart and soul into both speeches, but there isn't a moment of self-deprecation or humor or softening. I just go straight in. And the second one in particular about the Irish diaspora was so important to me. I really laid it on, and it became preachy. And it wasn't particularly well received by the audience of Dáil deputies and senators who were listening. They didn't like a president who was kind of preaching to them. It was hugely well received around the world and continues to be, and kind of
yes,
but that was a different story. But if I'd had the wish that I have now to understand that you have to first of all kind of just get on a level with people and then you can talk to them, it would have helped.
It's so true, though, in terms of the skill and the power of different styles of communication, and all of that is such an important part of advocacy, and the work that you do is really enriched by those diverse types of voices and experiences. I'm conscious of time, and I think one of the bringing it back to the here and now is the final question I'm going to put to you is really relating to the pandemic and COVID-19 and the lifestyle changes that we've seen as a result, as well as the really devastating impact that it's had, all of which is of course related to the topic we've been discussing this evening. Do you think that people's willingness to adapt and their capacity to be resilient and to show an ability to change is that cause for optimism in terms of our ability to change our behavior and take a different approach, do you think?
I certainly think COVID has really been a huge lesson here in Ireland and all around the world, and it's not a good lesson in parts. The lack of equitable access to vaccines is shameful, truly shameful and stupid, because until everybody is vaccinated and has access, we're not all going to be safe. We've had the variant, that has been rampant, because we didn't do enough, and scientists are warning, etc. But there's a lot of learning that we can do, and I'll just mention 4 lessons that I think are worth thinking about. First of all, COVID taught us that collective human behavior can actually matter, because that's what we did. We collectively started to do new tricks: social distancing, wearing masks, washing our hands properly for the first time. Little things, but we did them together, and they protected us before we got the vaccine, and even in the early rollout of the vaccine. We need collective behavior now. We need to think in terms of how collectively we can do things that will make a difference. Secondly, we've learned that science matters. The importance of the medical advice that was given, and the credibility of it, the authority of it for politicians. The NEFIT became, what the government had to do because the science was there. We have to be the same with climate science. Thirdly, government matters. There's a tendency, a neoliberal capitalism in our world that is still quite dominant, that wants to limit and play up the market forces as being really, really important. And we've learned that no, it's government that has to be really addressing the way in which a holistic approach is taken to something like a pandemic. And then the fourth thing is a softer thing, but I think it's quite important. Compassion matters. We saw all over Ireland during the COVID, the kindnesses of people, the help that was given, because people knew that it wasn't affecting all of us equally. They knew that people were worse off. They knew that there were abusive households. They tried to help. They tried to, there were so many different ways, and people will remember those acts of kindness. We need more empathy in our world. We need more, sense of being a humanity. A lot of change needs to take place. I think there are lessons we can draw from COVID. It has increased the inequality. We need to address that really systemically, and so on.
It's great to finish on a slightly optimistic note, I think, about what we can do and what's possible. I think it's been an enormous privilege and a pleasure speaking with you this evening and listening to you again. So thank you so much, Mary, for your really, really important words this evening. We're delighted to be able to present those to so many people. So thank you. I'm going to pass back now to Bailey, who's going to close this evening's event.
Okay, thank you.
Many thank you, and many thank you to Mrs. Mary Robinson. And there was a fascinating speech. I know I definitely learned a lot from it and a lot to take away from it. So I'm just going to say a few thank yous again before I pass over to Isabel Gallagher to fully close the event. Thank you to Professor Kilkelly for chairing it, to the Dean, Mark Poustie again, and to the Law School. And thank you again to all the attendees who joined tonight. Without you and without your support, these fantastic events we do run would not be possible. So it is great to have that, and we hope to see you throughout the year. There are still many more events planned for the rest of the year, so we look forward to that. Thank you to Mrs. Mary Robinson for coming and for founding this award. It's a true honour to have you here tonight, and of course this would not have came together without our wonderful education officer, Isabel Gallagher. So many thank you, Izzy, for organising this event. And do you want to say last 2 words before we close it out?
Thank you, Bailey. Mrs. Robinson, Professor Kilkelly, Professor Poustie, attendees. As the evening draws to a close, I would just like to once again thank everybody for attending, albeit virtually, and I would like to extend particular thanks to Mrs. Robinson and her team, Professor Kilkelly and Professor Poustie. I have found this myself to be highly insightful, and it is clear that climate justice is a hugely crucial issue today. As law students, it is important to recognise the changes that we can make, not only politically and through the law, but also through activism. This has been a huge honour. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.